Right out the boom. Shake it out the boom. Oh,
Throughout the Cold War, the United States used jazz ambassadors like Dizzy Gillespie as a means of diplomacy to expose the fallacies of the Soviet Union while also revealing the persisting issues of civil rights within the U.S.
World War II had just ended. There was much optimism for what the future would bring now, that all evil seemed to have been defeated. The start of the decade brought new beginnings to both good and bad. In America, people became more aware of civil rights. The Soviet Union was spreading propaganda about America. After World War II, the Potsdam Conference was held to discuss how to move forward and punish Germany post-war. Tensions at the meeting ran high between Stalin and Truman. And a year later, in 1946, the Soviet Union started to spread propaganda specifically concerning racial injustice within the United States. This is just one of the symptoms of a growing Cold War between the US and Russia.
Moving forward to 1955, the Soviet Union's propaganda on racial issues in the United States had only become worse. The propaganda was even more intensified due to the fact that the civil rights debate was heating up in America. President Eisenhower knew he had to do something to stop this growing trend. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., congressman during the time, had an idea. Powell understood that there was lots of competition in the arts between America and Russia. At the time, America had sent over ballet and orchestral groups, but they were not being very successful, as they were just reiterating something that the world had already seen. Powell wanted something that would represent the melting pot of cultures that America was, and the many people and groups that could work together to create music.
He pitched to the president that they should send some of the country's most influential jazz musicians around the world as ambassadors to build up connections and fight against the Soviet Union's propaganda. He understood that music could connect people. Music breaks language barriers. No matter where somebody comes from, they can understand music and connect with others through it. Jazz was the perfect idea for diplomacy with foreign countries. Originating in New Orleans, jazz swept the inner city community by storm. But what is jazz? Jazz is unique in that it represents the unity and the melting pot of cultures that America represents. Jazz was influenced by gospel, African rhythms, and personal expression that made jazz so unique yet so American.
After the Civil War, many freed enslaved persons entered the world of making music and combined their new freedom with elements of their African culture music, leading to the creation of experimental styles and ultimately, jazz. So with jazz being the perfect medium for creating diplomatic relations, President Eisenhower agreed. The most popular jazz ambassadors would be sent to Europe, the Middle East, and South America to convince the world that America was not racist. There is only one problem. These jazz musicians did not entirely agree with that message. Jim Crow laws were still in effect. The murder of Emmett Till had happened only a year earlier. There is no question that racism still existed in America, and many of the jazz musicians felt that they could not spread a false message.
However, it was also a great opportunity. The Jazz Embassy would give these musicians access to a new audience, an audience that had ears all around the world. The government's plan involved several prominent jazz musicians at the time, including Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong. The first jazz musician the government approached was Dizzy Gillespie.
Dizzy was extremely busy at the time and needed help putting together a band. so he asked 22-year-old jazz musician Quincy Jones to help him out. Dizzy and Quincy had a history together, and Quincy was more than happy to undertake the task. For several months, Quincy went around the United States searching for the best jazz musicians to join the band and go overseas with him and Dizzy. In March of the next year, 1956, Dizzy, Quincy, and the rest of the crew set out on the tour of a lifetime. None of them really knew what to expect, but they all were excited about the prospect of getting out into the world, discovering a new audience, and forming international connections.
Jazz, being entirely American, was also very new to these countries. They couldn't get enough of it. The same was true for leaders and diplomats that they were tasked with connecting with. Jazz grew more and more popular everywhere it was played, to the point where almost everyone had at least heard of it. Dizzy also found enormous financial success. He had struggled to get the money to have such a large band back in the US, but on this tour, he was back with the band. And not just any band, a band full of the country's finest jazz musicians, hand-selected by Quincy Jones. Dizzy's record label, Norgram, also saw the financial success of the embassy and wanted to capitalize on its success. They got Dizzy working on 2 new LPs, World Statement and Dizzy in Greece. They were released in 1957 to great commercial success, although some people were disappointed with the lack of live world tour recordings that were promised.
Nevertheless, the Jazz Embassy was a great success for Dizzy and for many other jazz ambassadors. It opened people's eyes to jazz and grew connections between the United States and other countries. If the only goal of the Jazz Embassy was to create diplomatic relations, then they would have been a huge success. The problem was that the main goal of the Jazz Embassy was to prove the Soviet Union and their propaganda wrong. Dizzy himself, while expressing how he thought the US had come a long way when it came to racial injustice, often brought up Emmett Till's murder while on the world tour.
During June and July of 1956, 3 congressional hearings took place, which put a minor obstacle in the ambassador's path. Representative John Rooney and Senator Alan Ellender questioned the director of the U.S. Information Agency, Theodore Strabert, about the effectiveness of the ambassador program. They argued that the benefits of the ambassador's efforts did not counter the effectiveness or cost of them. The hearings resulted in the budget for the projects being cut in half, from $9 million to $4.6 million. Strabert, however, would not stand for this verdict, and came back before the court just a few weeks later. Ellender ultimately stated that the project would do more harm than good, perpetuating the idea that Americans were almost barbaric.
Dizzy spoke out against this with a telegraph to President Eisenhower that he made public. In it, he said, "Shocked and discouraged by decision of the Senate in the supplementary appropriation bill to outlaw American jazz music as a way of making millions of friends for USA abroad. Our trip through Middle East proved conclusively that our interracial group was powerfully effective against red propaganda. Jazz is our own American folk music, the communication with all people regardless of language or social barriers. I urge that you do all in your power to continue exporting this invaluable form of American expression of which we are so proud."
While the jazz ambassadors did not change the landscape and wipe away all Soviet propaganda, they were able to compete against the Soviet Union in a way that the Soviets could not. The ambassadors shined a positive light on the U.S. by displaying a truly American and diverse form of art. Jazz showed that America could bring people together with something that was homegrown on American soil, and that represented the mix of cultures that America is. The jazz ambassadors represented the hope that America could become a better place, and that there was a uniqueness in America that was appreciated throughout the world.